Checkout tracking by the NPD Group brings you a receipt collecting system that gathers data anonymously through technology we created, providing your businesses with answers.
Hi, everybody. I apologize if this may come across as quite rapid. I have quite a lot of material that I want to sort of get through. And similarly, I would like to be able to do questions at the end. If I can, great. If I can't, I'll totally be outside and you can come bomb me for anything else that you kind of need sort of follow-up and all that sort of stuff. All right. So we're talking about 7 questions of core game design. And I like to start, I guess, beginning at the beginning. So one of my favorite quotes is the opening line of Dune, in which Virginia Madsen says, "Beginning is a very delicate time." Like many of you, I've been involved in more games that failed than succeeded over the years, and I've seen countless projects go awry, I've seen stuff blow up, I've seen people fight, I've seen fistfights at studios, I've seen all sorts. I've seen companies collapse, I've been involved in companies that collapsed many times. And most of the time, in retrospect, my feeling is the reason why many of those projects failed is because of how they were begun. I believe that successful games start from successful beginnings, and particularly a beginning is when projects are conceived and when, like, ambitions are raised and people are very excited about what the game might do and might be and all that sort of stuff. Beginning is when the project has new money and new people and, new studio digs and all new technology, new stuff to play with. Everybody's like, oh, this is going to be amazing and all that kind of stuff. Long story short, beginning is when the project has hope. But beginning is also when untested assumptions sneak in that later detonate a project. A beginning is when your team's ego wildly overestimates its own abilities. Beginning is when team members they develop very different ideas about what the game is actually going to be or what it's going to be like or whatever, and they kind of end up splitting off into parallel projects that don't actually gel. The problem, generally, is most of us actually don't know how to begin a project. We just sort of kind of dive in. And this is why I'm writing a book. It's one of the reasons why I'm writing this book, which is called Core Game Design, which is out next year, blah, blah, end of pitch. It's a set of tools and practices that studios of all types can use to better design games. And one of those tools particularly is what I call the 7 deadly questions. These are essentially 7 questions that I think you should be asking at the beginning of every project. Questions that sort of really do tend to need answers. And if those answers aren't really strong, you probably shouldn't start developing that game, because it's easy on paper, say, for example, to kind of put together the brief pitch of, well, I think the game's going to be like this, 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 and this. But once you get into development, everything suddenly takes 30 and 40 times as long to actually sort of come to fruition. And by the time you're doing that, if you're not set up on solid foundations, you're very likely developing something that's not actually going to work out. But it's going to take 6 months or a year before you figure out that that's actually what's going on. So yeah, so as I said, I am talking at speed because I have a lot to get through and not so much time, but we'll do our best. So question 1. Is your game's fiction urgent? There's going to be a list of these at the end, by the way. In games, we often talk about whether a game needs a story. But that's not what I'm talking about when I'm talking about fiction. What I'm talking about is the world in which the game is set. I'm talking about what a guy called Jesper Jules' kind of idea of fiction is, this notion that every game kind of has a setting. Every game sort of is in a place. Every game is kind of a world, that kind of thing. It can be abstract. Tetris is technically a fiction. I mean, it's a very simple fiction. It's blocks falling from the sky, but it's a fiction. Or it can be the World of Warcraft. It can be anything kind of in between. I'm not necessarily talking about fantasy worlds. I'm not necessarily talking about simulation or real world scenarios. I'm kind of covering all of those kind of all at once. But at root, there is always some sort of fiction there. Urgency, I love that picture. Urgency, on the other hand, is the quality of the fiction that creates pressure, and thus a need to solve, to do, to overcome, to win, to get better, to master, all those things. In a Jurassic fiction, he said, a Jurassic fiction is not urgent unless dinosaurs are chasing you through it. It's just a place. A word game fiction is not urgent unless the act of making bad words might cause you to lose. It's just a grid. Urgency is very important because without it, a game is often just a place to hang out, and players often won't do that indefinitely. They kind of need to have a point. In some fictions, it's easier to find the urgency than others. It's a little like cop and lawyer shows. Just as police and criminal drama, if you like, tends to be innate, very easy to formalize, and as a result, you get 10,000 shows of that theme. Certain fictions for games lend themselves very easily to urgency. Good example is war scenarios. A good example is farming games. A good example is kind of abstract thinky puzzles like Match 3 or that kind of stuff. Others, I think it's harder for them to find their innate urgency. Sometimes it takes a little more work to sort of get there. A good way to do it is to figure out whether your fiction is urgent by asking whether it can be quantified. So if you can express it, say, by talking about how the resources move, how the game is blocked, how the various fail and win states kind of emerge from doing that, and if you can display that in fairly simple language and maybe not with a crazy, speedy Irish accent, then you're probably on the right track. You're probably sort of onto something that will kind of very easily make sense and will coalesce fairly quickly. On the other hand, if your urgency is kind of vague, like, oh, your doom is coming, or something like that, that usually indicates a problem. It usually indicates that you're not thinking clearly enough about the sort of core mechanics of the game. You're not really actually seeing how the loops, if you like, are going to work. One example is exploration games. It's actually very common with exploration games. It's not quite clear what you're supposed to do, right? It's very hard to make an exploration game that isn't boring. And a lot of the time, doing so involves putting a lot of missions or tasks or other kind of layers of urgency, if you like, on top of the world in order to try and give it some dynamism. A good example is Minecraft, which is a totally creative exploration game, but it has creepers, and it has them for a reason. In the early part of the game, particularly when you're just sort of figuring it out, if there's nothing really coming at you in Minecraft, you very likely would just sort of go, I don't get it, and leave. And that would be the case with a lot of players. The fact that there's even this basic level of something going, ooh, kind of at you, makes it dynamic, makes you go, crap, I need to like build a wall, right? And then from there, you're like, how do I build? Oh, and you sort of go from there. So yeah, urgency, very important, very key, very simple, but at the same time, often kind of skipped. My second question is, what's the player's job? In most game pitches, we'll focus on, say, for example, telling me who the player's avatar is, how he's a hero, what his origin story might be, his motivation, and all that sort of stuff, all very, story-like and stuff, and that's fine. Maybe they might talk about how he appeals to certain demographics, or how he has certain market qualities, or all of that sort of stuff as well. Again, fine, no problem. That's not the question I'm actually asking, though. What I mean is, what does the player do? As a game designer, I'm not actually that interested in who the player's avatar is as a person, or whether he's got appeal to 12-year-old boys. I'm interested in what it does, what its job is. And my job, for example, in the game of Tetris is sorter. I sort things. That's all I do. My job in Tomb Raider is unlocker, right? I run around, I hit stuff, whatever, but really what I'm trying to do is essentially just unlock pieces of levels. That's what I do. In Rome Total War, it's general. I order armies, right? What I'm describing is essentially my job is the sort of linchpin activity, if you like, that I perform in the game that turns the game from a sort of an uncertain state to a state of success. The thing that I do that is necessary for the game to get to a win, if you like, and which if I don't do it or if I do it badly, the game will go toward a fail. My job is the thing that essentially sort of stops the world from ending. My job is the thing that stops the world from falling apart. My job is the thing that stops the story from not being told. All of those kinds of things. My key function in the game, what is that? What do I actually do? And defining that has two good, early, important advantages. One, it establishes how the game world moves around me. And this is one of the key points of failure in many game designs. Often what they tend to do is create a working simulation of a world and then kind of forget about the player until later, right? So you have it takes so long to get this thing up and running, to get your physics engine working, all that sort of stuff. It might take half a year, right? Then you're like, so, okay, but so what? Right? Probably, and I don't mean to sort of rag on them, but probably one of the most tragic examples of that was my friend's Introversion in the UK, who spent 5 years working on that kind of, I can't remember the name of it, but it was a sort of a spy game. But they spent so long working out the city simulation and all that sort of stuff. And after half a decade, they realized there was no game there. And they had to just canics. They're like, we spent our fortunes. We've had to fire a lot of people, all that sort of stuff, to create essentially just a virtual box. It has no purpose. And so they went and they made Prison Architect instead, which is way better. The second reason is it gives me a sense of the likely boundaries of the game. If my job is the criminal, right, as in Grand Theft Auto, it's really not likely that the game's going to ask me to sort threes of objects. So you can just exclude a lot of that kind of stuff straight out of your design. If it's a footballer, like say in FIFA Soccer, it's really unlikely that I'll be asked to wait tables. So I can kind of probably remove a lot of potential ideas. What I'm talking about essentially is context. By setting down the job of the player early, you can really quickly get to what's in the game and what's not in the game, what's relevant to the game, what's a distraction, what's the sort of stuff that we actually need to prototype well versus what are we not going to bother with at all because it's just nonsense. What fits versus what doesn't fit. Tell me what the job is and I can tell you what the game experience essentially will be. Can't tell me what the job is, I'm not going to know. You're going to spend a lot of time prototyping things that don't fit together. Third question. Sorry, again, I'm talking in a red and knots here. Are your verbs natural? So in game design world, in my game design world, verb describes what happens in the real world side of the screen. It's the thing that I do with my fingers or other appendages, such as moving the mouse, clicking the left button, pulling the right trigger, holding X, tapping the screen, things I do with my fingers, tap, swipe, whatever. It's when I say things like, I clicked that, I swiped left, and all that sort of stuff. That's what I call a verb, right? Knowing the verbs of a game, for example, I intend to only use the face buttons and the triggers and only one of the joystick sticks, say. Or I intend to build a game that's entirely based around tilting. Or I intend to build a game that uses the keyboard very extensively, lots of different key patterns, say in an MMO or something. So I'm not going to use, let's say, a trackpad as well, that kind of stuff. Gives me a good sense of whether the game is likely to have cognitive overhead issues, which I love as a phrase, which is what I have there. A complicated game is neither good or bad. I'm not talking about that the game is complicated, therefore. What I mean is that a verbally complicated game, an interface complicated game, a game that kind of requires me to remember like 12 different controls to sort of do things, is often something that does indicate a design problem. It indicates like a lack of hierarchical logic, and indicates a lack of kind of thought through as to how, say, teaching a simple control will lead to a complex behavior, those kinds of things. If you're just going, oh yeah, we'll just use all this kind of stuff, then what you often end up is with a game that feels very bitty, where like this thing does this and this thing does that, but they don't really relate, and I'm just mentally having to remember all of those kind of interfaces all the time. Verbal complexity means player has to physically learn a lot of control, which means staring at my hands rather than at the screen, which is generally bad for like immersion or things like that. You sometimes can get away with that, of course. I mean, fighting games are a really good example. If you have a good natural logic, and by that I mean, in fighting games you have a really good structure where you have like the punch button and the kick button and the duck and the dodge and the back and the forth and stuff. And then the game essentially asks the player to learn a lot of patterns, like red, red, blue, 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 red, which is quite fun for them because there's a lot of discovery involved, and as they do so, they feel like they're mastering the game. But they're built on fairly basic foundational logic. They can kind of intuit their way into a lot of them. And then from there, they feel like they're really good at the game, and they have essentially a lore that other players don't have. You get a similar thing with MMOs a lot, where like the simple logic of playing the game is fairly straightforward, but then setting up a lot of your kind of keybinds and stuff like that is kind of like part of the mastery of the game, and how like the really good players kind of consider it to be like a key skill, but it sort of flows from the simple interface fairly well. It's not all, just thrown at them in some weird random abstract order. They can actually figure their way through it. So a natural kind of order to what you're doing in the game can allow you to build a lot of complexity if you want, but it kind of needs to be approached in that sort of, as I say, natural kind of way. So not like just weird, not just kind of, there's 48 things, just learn them, straight up, things like that. A lot of how you want to onboard your players comes from being able to kind of naturally bring them into the game very easily and not make it sound like as though, they're trying to take an intelligence test just to be allowed to play. The opposite is unnatural verbs. This is a picture of a car from 1904 or something like that, before they figured out the conventions of using things like a steering wheel. And you had all these like weird controls that people would sort of try and sort of use all the time and figure, to drive just a simple thing. There's a great episode of Top Gear, actually, where they have, before everything blew up at Top Gear, where they have Jeremy Clarkson and the guys like trying to learn how to drive a 1904 car. And it's kind of ridiculous. They're like, but what I do is quite simple with the wheel and stuff. And then I have this weird thing, we've got 8 gears and 4 levers, and there's a thing for like, and all that sort of stuff. This is what I mean by unnatural, weird, strange, doesn't quite follow from how your body kind of feels like it's a sort of work or that kind of thing. If you can't, now, I want to sort of take a step back for a sec. It's not necessarily a bad thing to have weird controls. My point is more that if you're going to make a game that is intentionally weird, it's a really good idea to maybe get out there and be very intentional about it and go, this is a strange, indie games do this a lot, this is a strange game, it's intentionally bonkers and stuff. And then people will kind of go for it, right? But if you're just trying to make, say, a normal farming game or something, but like you're trying to do it with like wacky controls, you're probably going to find that people are just going to be like, I don't really get what's going on here, I don't really understand it, and all that sort of stuff. All right. 4, do your actions extend? Verbs, fingers, stuff, like I said. That's all what happens on this side of the screen. On the other side of the screen is, I guess, what you might call input, right? And generally speaking, I tend to think of there are sort of 3 kinds of input. One is what you might call a query. Have you ever played, have any of you played Her Story? Yeah. You should play it. It's really great. It's 2 hours of your life. You'll just be totally like, it's amazing. Her Story is a game based on queries. You basically spend your entire time searching through a database of video clips, looking for the one that will trigger the win condition for the game, and then learning the story, if you like, along the way. And that's kind of one kind of input. Doom, on the other hand, famously had all the red, yellow, and blue keys, and sort of a lot of doors that you kind of had to trick through. There wasn't really a way to kind of game them as such. You just found the key, and at some point or another, when you walked up to them, you just literally go flick, and they would open, right? So her story is based on queries. That's mechanic in Doom is based on what I call nudges. Fine. But the third kind of input, the one that's actually much more common in games and much more interesting generally, is action. And an action is essentially an unscripted state change. So it's like twisting the Tetris block into whatever order I want in order to try and form lines. It's planting my crops wherever I want to plant them in order to try and harvest them efficiently. It's laying out my city. It's ordering my troops. It's driving my car. It's like all of those things that we essentially call gameplay, or that we mostly call gameplay in a sort of a narrow concept. When you're moving an avatar, say, from one location to another, twisting a Tetris block, shooting a gun, commanding troops, yada, 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 you're taking action. And for game design to work, actions kind of need to be what I call extensible. What does that mean? In Thomas Was Alone, there's two kinds of action. You move and you jump. It seems basic, but the game uses those two actions in lots of interesting ways throughout, through the use of a query of swapping. So you can swap from one character to another, and the different characters have different properties of move and jump. Some of them can jump higher, some of them are bigger, some of them can float, stuff like that. You swap from, say, Thomas to Claire, Chris to James, James who has reverse gravity, all of those kinds of things, and they all have different properties. And the result is the game, through swapping and using these basic actions, can create a series of incredibly elaborate puzzles. And those puzzles are fascinating because the actions themselves are quite simple, but the subtle variations in the way that they're being extended this way and that way and another way lead the player to kind of reconsider the game experience over and over and over again, and to try and figure out new ways to be better at the game. And that's why it's fun. It's not necessarily the case that in order to make extensible actions that you need to put like 500 things that the player can do in the game, 500 different kind of actions. If anything, that actually tends to be counterproductive. What matters is ensuring that your game actions have an increasing range of utility throughout the game. Thomas Was Alone again. It's simple move and jump, right? Mario, simple move and jump. But then what you can do with that as a sort of a basis leads to a very elaborate game. What you can do with different objects, for example, leads to a very elaborate game. And that's how it stays interesting. You don't want your players to feel like their game is complicated, but you also at the same time don't want it to feel like it's an assembly line. And making sure your actions can extend is what leads many games to copy one another, unfortunately. There are zillions of potential actions that we as designers can use, but only a small number are robust enough to actually be extensible. There is a reason why you keep seeing jumping games, for example, 30 years after platformers were invented. They're kind of one of those actions that are just very easily extended. Shooting games, they're one of those kind of actions that are very easily extended. Farming games, layout games, like stuff like that. There's a lot of other maybe one-state things, or the sort of stuff that you see triggered in like QuickTime events, or things like games involving dialogue or that kind of stuff, that are not as extensible, and they don't really work as easily for that. So trying to base a game completely on them tends to be a much more difficult task, and tends to lead to much less, say, long-term engagement or those kinds of things. If you are lucky enough to discover a great new action, Portal is a good example, then go for it. But just, you really need to be sort of clear with yourself whether your actions are as extendable as you kind of hope they are. Right, question 5. Do you have 3 resource types? So in the game of tennis, 2 players face off against one another in a battle of wits and skill. They serve, volley, return, play winners, yada, 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 and the result is often pretty epic. Why does tennis work? And the answer, I think, lies in its resources. And there are 4 key resources in tennis. The first is the ball. Ball is a currency. I know that sounds a bit weird, but bear with me. It's a currency in the sense of that the player is trying to trade the ball for points by passing it over the line at the other end of the court, right? Every time that there's a sort of a play in motion, what am I trying to do? I'm trying to get 1 point by turning this into 1 point. And my opponent is trying to stop me from doing that. That's the entire sort of gameplay, I feel like. It's a trading game just with a lot of running around. The second resource that makes the first resource valuable is the points themselves, and they're larger denominations of games and sets and matches. Points aren't a currency, they're a meter. And a number that the player accumulates through successful ball trades, and players generally don't lose points, and accumulating them triggers the win condition of the game. Third resource is the racket. Racket is what I call a tool. In tennis, every player is permitted to use only 1 racket at a time, no jading with 2, and she uses it to trade the ball with considerably more force that she can likely manage with her hand. The tool, therefore, kind of empowers her play. And then the last resource is territory, the court itself. So the lines, the outlines, the inlines, the net, all that sort of stuff. Most of the tactics of tennis involve pinning your opponent into a position, right, so that you can open up more room at the other side of the court to blast the ball through in order to trade successfully. That's essentially the strategy of the entire game, is trying to get your guy to be over there so that when you take a shot over there, he has absolutely no chance of running over to pick it up. It's the entire game. And that's, as I say, it's called a territory. So you get currencies, meters, tools, and territory. And these, it turns out, are the 4, if you like, kind of cardinal types of resource that you see again and again in all games. You don't see them all equally. Not all games feature territory, for example. Not all games feature currency. Not all games feature meters, like whatever. But it's rare to find a successful game that doesn't have at least 3. And I don't necessarily mean by that, I don't mean, say, and I know because particular casual Connect crowd is probably very much in love with this kind of stuff, I don't mean like having 9 currencies or something like that. I don't mean having, say, 8 types of the same thing that kind of do the same stuff, but, you know, in an economic sense, it sounds like they're cool. You might be able to move the player from one to the other and monetize them better and all that sort of stuff. That's all fine, but that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is 3 types of resource. What I'm talking about is multi-dimensional play. What I'm talking about is by having, say, solely currencies as part of your kind of game design and offering no meters, no territory, and no tools to play with, the game's boring. What I mean is having only territory, something to sort of walk around, like I said, exploration games a few minutes ago, but nothing to really do with it. It's boring. People might like it as a sort of an art piece for like an hour or 2, but they're not really going to hang around. Particularly if you want to create, say, high engagement, you know, long-term LTV games like, you know, we were talking about earlier on, sort of games that people will play for years at a time. You really need to have a good mix of types of resource, not just a bunch of resources. You really need to think a lot about whether they fall, whether you're kind of really hitting those kind of poles properly rather than sort of just replicating the same kind of system again and again and again. Number 6, I'm nearly done. Sorry, I know I'm getting sort of hassled for time here a little bit, but just I'm rushing as fast as I can. What's your defining rule? Now, I love this picture. Game designers often want to give their player more power, more guns, more stuff, more things, more bigger splashes, louder bangs, more emotion, all those kinds of things. More choice, you might say. Okay, fine. But it's not necessarily fun if that's all the game is. If the game is just essentially a consistent and constant expression of power, that actually kind of gets dull in its own way fairly fast. It's necessary in order to get to what Sid Meier would have called, say, a series of interesting choices for games to limit as much as they empower. So they need rules, right? And particularly, video games are a bit of a black box when it comes to rules. They're unlike other games where, say, if I'm playing a board game, all of the rules are kind of apparent to me. I know how the dice roll, I know where the tokens go, and like all of that sort of stuff. With video games, they actually have thousands or hundreds of thousands of rules, and most of them are not knowable to the player. They're not visible. They just sort of operate, if you like, kind of off their own bat. However, and this is pretty interesting, many successful games do have at least one, what you might call a defining rule. A rule that's actually kind of unique, a rule for which the game is known, a rule that preferably the players have never seen before, and so essentially a rule that becomes like a kind of a signature for the game. A good example is the rule of check, right, in chess. Check is the kind of check rule is what makes chess compared to like a lot of other games, right? You know it instantly in popular conversation. You might refer to check or checkmate or whatever. People get exactly what you mean. They know exactly what you're talking about. They understand it's the context of chess, right? The handball rule in soccer is a defining rule. The way that Animal Crossing revolutionized the use of time was a defining rule at its time. It's kind of being co-opted a lot now. The way that Resident Evil deliberately uses awkward controls, the way that Eco uses a kind of a partnership dynamic where you have to like move this other character around in order to get safe. Those are all examples of defining rules. And the best bit about defining rules is that they become famous. They can sometimes be patented, which is good, but on popular level, they're also really good insurance against clones, copycats, and all that sort of stuff kind of coming in and taking over your game. Destroying your brand and your IP value. Everybody knows that do not pass go refers to Monopoly, for example, even though you might get 500 other games that are like sort of, you know, Trivia Monopoly or whatever, they all kind of refer to Monopoly at a root. Ironically enough, Monopoly itself is a clone of a game called the Landlord's Game, but it's the first one that really kind of popularized and got that rule out to a lot of people, and it's therefore the one that it's kind of become, if you like, in people's minds. So I always encourage clients to try and begin a project by searching for a defining rule. I'm always kind of trying to urge people to like at least 2% original. Like even if your game is going to fall into a fairly known genre, even if you're going to sort of go, say for example, say if you're in slots or something, right? If you're going to go down a certain line, you're in the slots market, try and at least come up with one different thing about your game that isn't the same as everybody else's. And I don't just mean different ways of, representing experience points. I don't mean ephemera. I don't mean peripheral stuff. I mean the kind of core rules of the game. Try and come up with something individuating that isn't the same as everything else. I would also say don't worry too much about your rule being the most original rule of all time. That's not necessary. Usually it's sufficient that a rule be defining on a platform just for its current audience. So for example, Candy Crush Saga took the Bejeweled kind of principle and put together with like a move counter. Move counters are in lots of other games from way back in the day, right? You play turn-based games, you know what they are. But to that audience in that time, it was fresh, it was new, and it made for them a new game experience. And that is often enough, particularly in mobile, where there's a lot less, if you like, depth of history amongst the audience than there is in, say, PC gaming or something like that. Usually that's enough to kind of get there. Right, I'm going to fire through the last one. The last question is, what's your core test? So I often think of games as either activities or economies, and by that I mean players either trying to solve an obvious problem with skill, like shooting stuff, or the players trying to solve a strategic problem with, or a puzzle problem with strategic thinking, usually the application of and the movement of resources in the right areas, sim games, war games, things like that. Grim Fandango is an example of an economy game. It's a lot of like matching objects to other objects in order to try and unlock doors. Resident Evil 4, on the other hand, is an activity game. It's shooting things in the face. Many games mix activity and economy, however, one tends to be dominant over the other. And this is important because the dominant of the pair generally is the one that defines what I call the core test, the primary challenge of the game, right? And successful games generally test some quality of the player over and over, especially if they're long-term games looking for high engagement. The core test underpins why the fiction is urgent, why the player has his job, why the verbs and actions are set up as the way they are, why the player must use resources, and finally why the defining rule prevents all of the above from being easy. Add all of those up and you can see why your game is fun. But not all tests are made equal. Sorry, I have 2 more slides. One example of a game with a bad core test, for example, is LA Noire. It looks great and has a cool story and all the rest of it, but the core kind of detection and interrogation mechanics didn't challenge either activity or economy. They instead challenged intuition, which in real terms means they essentially were just based on guesswork. And they weren't, as a result, masterable. They weren't fun. There wasn't a logic to them. There wasn't anything to really build on for the player. So it's a lot of just button bashing and kind of wait until the game says, okay, you win, right? Good core tests are explicit and about skill or smarts and objects and numbers. They're about sorting, organizing, moving, aiming logic, all that sort of thing, what you might call left brain skills. And a great way to answer this question is in form of writing it out like this. I want to test the player's abilities to, and then provide an answer. To sort, to jump, to spell, to solve, to do math, to, things that are very, very easily expressible as kind of what I said earlier about clear activities. Easy actions, things that are straightforward, extendable things that you can see 100 different versions of the same thing sort of coming from, but that they're going to be challenging each and every time. You should be aware of the fact that that does make your game probably sound quite reductive. One piece of feedback that I get a lot from people is like, you're just saying my game is just about jumping and springing on things, but I want to tell a great tale. And it's like, yeah, great, but it needs to be based on jumping and springing on things. And so it goes. Right, I think that's probably it. I'm really getting some stern looks here. So that's the sort of 7 questions in total. As I say, I'm going to be outside if you want to ask some questions. We probably need to move on, I suppose, to the next speaker. But,
guys,
thank you.